In view of the amount of material we need to cover today, I want to start promptly. So today we're going to be focusing on the complexities and mechanics of actually building a multi-scheme deployment. So building on this work, a lot of work that's been done on foreign exchange, which is obviously a necessary prerequisite, necessary but not sufficient. So Michael is going to talk today about this, but first we've asked Jonathan Pinifolo from the COMESA Business Council to say a few words to start us off. So Jonathan, are you there? Yep.
Oh, all right. Thank you,
Thank you.
Paul. So essentially, I think as you're also aware that we're almost reaching an advanced stage of our deployment in the COMESA. As of last Friday, we just received submissions. There's quite a huge interest, about 14 applicants we've received so far, and essentially we're looking at somewhere around 21, 22 to do the evaluation, and probably after that the works need to commence. And as of now, our ambition is still, as of November, to have the platform up and running. The good thing is that the COMESA Committee of Central Bank Governors, the reps, endorsed. Of course, subject, we had sent them some other materials that they were looking for. And just one thing, probably, I think that might need to be put into consideration is to say that from the last meeting, Bank of Mauritius, whom were targeting, they were saying that probably for the system also to work perfectly, we need to have the central banks opening an accounts with Bank of Mauritius. So that's their only thing that they are looking for in as far as implementing the platform is concerned. But also going forward, they have requested for a meeting whereby they also want to understand all our requirements before the implementation is done. So in brief, Paul, that's what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's really useful. I'm sure that we can facilitate that over the coming weeks. Against that background, Michael, perhaps we can hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me. Are you seeing that?
Yes, indeed.
Excellent. Okay, just a bit of preamble before I start. This is intended really to look at the business aspects, the product aspects of a scheme which allows multiple modular loop and non-modular loop schemes to interact with each other. It looks at the sorts of things that are required, and it proposes some ways in which they might be achieved. It's not a technical meeting. There is a technical meeting which is currently being scheduled. The most likely time for that at the moment is late morning UTC, I should say, next Monday. Well, whatever it is, 11th. There is a doodle poll on the Design Authority channel in Slack, which you are very welcome to join and express preferences. This will be an open session. Now, normally, as you probably know, Design Authority sessions are closed and there's a group of participants who are allowed to. We decided that given the importance and interest of this topic, it would be better to make this an open session, and therefore anybody who wants to will be able to attend. And I very much hope that we will get good attendance, possibly even better than the attendance we have today. So, with that, let me start and see what we can do. So, my first question is, what are we trying to do? we're trying to support payments between customers of DFSPs which belong to different payment schemes. And that means IIPS payment schemes, however we define that eventually. We want to be able to support any number of schemes, i.e. we don't want to impose an arbitrary number on the, as an arbitrary limit on the kinds of the numbers of schemes that can be connected with each other. And we want to be able to support any topography of schemes. For instance, we might have something like that, where we have a regional scheme at the center and a number of jurisdictional schemes which interact with each other through the regional scheme. And those of you who've been involved with the conversations we've had with CPC will know that that's, at the moment at least, the model that we're proposing for the COMESA scheme. But it's not the only topography that we would like to support. For instance, we might also want to have something like this, where you have a number of jurisdictional schemes which simply communicate with each other in a kind of long daisy chain affair. Or we might indeed want to have something which mixes the two and which allows a regional scheme to be in the middle of a group of other schemes, and one of those jurisdictional schemes also to be connected with other jurisdictional schemes. We want basically not to be constrained in not to constrain our implementers by insisting that they implement a particular kind of topography in order to link their schemes together. We also want this to be invisible to participants. If we possibly can, we want it to be something which doesn't require a participant institution, a DFSP, to know whether or not it's working in a scheme which is interacting with other schemes or working with a scheme which is working on its own. And we want also to allow schemes to operate in single scheme or multi-scheme environments without modification. And that really means that we don't want people to have to choose between a multi-scheme implementation and a single scheme implementation. We want that to be a configurable attribute of a standard modular loop system, so that you can take it off the shelf and you can decide whether you want that implementation to be working in a single scheme environment or in a multi-scheme environment. And finally, we want to be able to retain all the features of a single scheme modular loop system. So we want to know that if we implement a multi-scheme system, we won't be shutting ourselves off from some functional parts of the modular loop system as it currently exists. Now, an example architecture, and I'll be talking using this as an example a bit later on, but I just wanted to put it up first, is something which is somewhat like what we're proposing for the COMESA scheme. So on the left-hand side, you've got scheme A, which transacts in a particular currency. It has a DFSP, which is the debtor in this case, and a proxy, which connects it to a multi-currency regional scheme, which has its own switch and a foreign exchange provider. On the right-hand side, we have another proxy which connects the regional scheme to another jurisdictional scheme, which again has its own switch and which has another DFSP attached to it, which we will treat as the creditor. And the scenario is that DFSP 1 sends 1,000 Malawian kwacha to DFSP 2. DFSP 2 receives 20 Zambian kwacha. And currency conversion is done in scheme. Again, that's the model that we are currently proposing for the CBC system. So let me look at the problems that I think we need to solve, in order to implement a scheme like that. First of all, how do we identify beneficiaries when they're in different countries and attached to different schemes? That is to say, how do we generalize the existing account lookup process so that it can work across schemes? Second, how do we know where to route a message to if it's intended for a DFSP in another scheme? So we've said already that we want to implement, we don't want to constrain people to particular types of topology, but that means that essentially we have to have quite a generalized way of understanding where to route a message to if it's routed for somewhere else, if it's routed to a DFSP attached to a different scheme from our scheme. We need to be able to ensure that all the obligations inside all of the schemes always balance with each other. And what that means is, Modular Loop, as you know, is an implementation that supports double entry bookkeeping. Every debit must be balanced with a credit. And we need to make sure that where we are routing payments between multiple schemes, each of those schemes always remains in balance in terms of the debts and credits which are incurred by its participants. We need to understand now, as you know, the Modular Loop system employs timeout as a way of making sure that we don't ask our participants to commit funds to open-ended payments. When someone requests a payment in the Modular Loop scheme, it always has a time limit associated with it. And if the payment reaches that time limit, then it times out and is cancelled. We need to be able to manage how that works across multiple implementations of Modular Loop and indeed other schemes. We also need to be able to manage the requirements for pre-funding when a payment is passing through multiple schemes. Now, as you doubtless know, Modular Loop insists that the debtor party to a payment, and indeed to a currency conversion, has sufficient liquidity available to cover that obligation when it's incurred in the process of settlement. Now, the combination of multiple schemes and the requirements for balancing obligations inside each scheme is going to mean that there are debits in some schemes which are not directly attached to participants, and we need to have a way, a configurable way, of understanding how we're going to manage that. Next, we need to be able to ensure that payments can be tracked across all of the schemes through which they pass. So those are the questions that I hope I'm going to answer over the course of this presentation. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Any areas that people feel I should have covered but haven't? Any areas where I've pointed to something and people don't understand what I mean? I can't see people's hands, by the way, so...
No, there are no hands up at the moment.
Oh, okay, fantastic. Okay, right, let's start thinking about beneficiary identification. So, the situation today is that participants maintain their association with an identifier manually using the /participants endpoint in the FSP IOP API. That may not be true for all Oracle types. As you know, our distinction between the address lookup service and the individual oracles means that where there is a general service available, and the example we always use is Pathfinder, the GSMA service, which resolves phone numbers, MSDNs to mobile network operators. But there are others as well, and we've always said, for instance, where a government has a national identity card lookup service, then we can use that. So it's not true for all our Oracle types. And at the moment, if an identifier isn't found in an Oracle, then the payment can't be made. It just gets rejected. Now, in a multi-scheme environment, I think really there are two alternatives. First of all, we could retain the existing system and essentially forward new entries and changes to the oracles of all the other schemes. So that's the kind of thing that essentially says there is a copy. It's rather like DNS in the sense that there is a copy in each scheme of the oracle information from all of the other schemes, as well as the scheme's own oracle. Alternatively, we could move to an event-driven system, and I will explain in a bit more detail what I mean by that. So an event-driven system for address resolution means that participants don't need to register identifiers for their customers. When an Oracle can't match an identifier, which is requested by a DFSP, it asks all the DFSPs it knows about whether they recognize that identifier. You long-time modular loop types will recall that this is the way in which the non-switch modular loop is intended to work in all cases. It just does a round robin and asks everybody, do you recognize this identifier? In this case, if any of the DFSPs knows about the identifier, it responds with a positive identification. And the Oracle then caches the response. And the next time the DFSP asks about that identifier, the Oracle has an identification. It simply forwards the request to the DFSP, which it now knows about. If a customer's moved their account, then the target DFSP, the DFSP that was identified in the Oracle, will reject the request because it no longer has that identifier matching an account that it holds, and the round robin starts again. Now, so that essentially is the characteristic of an event-driven system for address resolution. There are pros and cons, amazingly, to all of this. The event-driven system is expensive compared with the existing system the first time a customer is a beneficiary, because we go through this round-robin lookup process that I've just described. Subsequently, it's equivalent to the existing system. There's no difference. No changes are required at the DFSP for an event-driven system. It simply responds to get parties' requests in the way it does now. And it will work unmodified for oracles which connect to third-party systems like Pathfinder. In fact, it's more efficient than the existing system for these, since results are cached on return. And therefore, although you might need to go to Pathfinder to identify a Misden first time round, subsequently you don't. You can just take the local identification that you got the first time round. Like the existing system, it needs a strategy for coping with duplicates, but we think that this is a problem which is actually associated with all types of address lookup. We will need to solve it, we know, but we will need to solve it separately from the question of whether we should use event-driven or preloaded address identification. Cross-scheme duplicates may complicate this problem, of course, because it may be that you have an identifier which is unique in one system, but is also used in another system. If neither of those systems is the one which the original inquirer belongs to. And we could make the system more efficient, the event-driven system, that is, by caching the DFSP identifier information on other calls, such as post quotes or post transaction requests. Now, in both of those, the mapping between an identifier and a sending DFSP is included in the body of the message. So that would give us an opportunity to cache the identifications for sending parties as well as for receiving parties, which is what I've described here. So how would we implement this? We'd implement it in the ALS, I think, rather than in the individual oracles, because A, that's simpler, and we always like things which are simple. It would mean that all the oracles in a scheme would work in the same way. Individual oracles would not need to be modified. And address resolution methods would, we imagine, be configurable. So existing schemes would continue to work. They're configured to use the existing system. So that's how we would imagine this would work. Now, I've got what eventually will be a relatively rather complicated diagram which will explain how this will work. But I will attempt to go through it quickly and show you how the flows will result, first of all, in our discovering that the Misden we want to pay is in fact at DFSP2, and also how the oracles in all three schemes will wind up caching that identifier. or the identifier to DFSP association. So first of all, we ask switch A, do you know about this Lisden? Switch A says no, asks its oracle. The oracle says no, I don't know about it either. Switch A now says, how many proxies have I got? I've got proxy A. So it sends to proxy A, which forwards the message to switch C. This is exactly the same message, get parties message, that was originally sent out. Switch C asks the same question. Do I have that identifier in my oracle? The answer again is no. So the switch knows, I should add, that at this point, DFSP1 can be accessed via proxy A because it got a message that came from DFSP1 but was actually proximally routed to it via proxy A. So that's an important point that I want to continue to emphasize. So now the switch says, what proxies have I got? The answer comes back, proxy B, forget about that, we'll get on it later. And that goes across to proxy B, which sends it to switch B. Now, switch B asks its oracle, and the answer, it can also say, I'm going to cache, a request from DFSP1 comes from proxy B. So if I need to know how to reach DFSP1 in the future, I need to send a message via proxy B. Now, the oracle does know about this identification, and it routes it through to DFSP2, the creditor DFSP. DFSP2 says, yep, I recommend that. What am I saying? It doesn't have that already. What it does is say, I will send it to all the DFSPs I know about, which is in this case only DFSP2. DFSP2 responds positively, and in step 18 there, the identification between DFS2 and that Lisden is cached. We then go back to the scheme, and we have a positive identification that says, first of all, that if the multi-currency scheme wants to send a message to DFSP2, it needs to send it via proxy B. Also, it means that the oracle in switch 2, sorry about that, can store the association between the Lisden and DFSP2. It's sent back to switch A, which also caches the knowledge that if it wants to talk to DFSP2, it goes via proxy A and stores the result in the oracle, the identification between the Lisden and the DFSP, and sends the result back in the normal way to the DFSP1. So DFSP1 just gets a response that in the form it would normally expect, i.e. a positive put parties, which says, yep, DFSP2 is the person you want to talk to if you want to send this, so this identifier. So nobody here, in terms of the DFSPs, needs to do anything different from what they do now. They just get these requests, which are get parties requests in the normal form. They respond to them with put parties requests in the normal form. And all the information that's going through the system is being harvested by the proxy, by the switches, and by the oracles. So that each of the oracles now knows about the association between that Lisden and DFSP2, and also each of the switches knows where to route a request if it's intended either for DFSP1 or for DFSP2. That's kind of complicated, and it wasn't helped by the fact that my arrow identification was, shall we say, less than starry. But I'm going to pause there and ask if anyone wants to raise any questions about how that process might work.
Really hoping there are some questions at this point, because otherwise I'm going to think that people aren't paying attention.
Sorry, Rob has put something in the chat that says, can I clarify? This is working to an assumption of modulo loop at switch A and switch B. Answer, no, it isn't.
but one which functions in a similar manner.
Well, one where the proxy functions in a similar manner. That is essentially the question that we are asking. So in each case, I mean, if we imagine, for instance, that scheme B was not a modular loop scheme, then as long as the proxy functioned in a way that the two modular loop schemes, the regional scheme and scheme A, expected, everything would work fine.
Julie has raised her hand.
Ah, Julie.
Yes, I just one question, like let's say you have like a switchy. Does that mean you will also broadcast to switchy as well, and switchy will respond, no, I don't know this ID?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And the second question I have is like, okay, so I'm not sure it's a requirement in this case, but like thinking of offline payment, how would you do, right? Because if this is potentially like, you know, offline payment peer-to-peer through through Bluetooth, then it's considered as an offline payment. And here, like, how do you broadcast?
So my answer to that is, I think, subject to the correction of people who know far more about modular loop than me, is that modular loop is a way of connecting connecting DFSPs. It's not a way of connecting customers. The connection to the customer is a matter for the DFSP to manage, and modular loop and indeed non-modular loop IIPS schemes, I think, are not interested in it. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah, so basically what you're saying, it's out of scope.
Yes. Ah,
Yeah,
sorry. I knew that
we understand how to do offline payments, but it's kind of out of scope for modular loop.
Yeah.
There was a demonstration of offline payments recently put together by some folks in the community.
Yeah.
Reach out to me if you want some details about that. Yeah. So it has been proven to be workable on a modular loop transaction flow. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will reach out separately.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Steve has just put in the chat that somewhere we must have the Crunchfish video.
Yes, Crunchfish were the folks that did it.
Yes. But from a modular loop perspective, an offline transaction is invisible. All we see is what amounts to a cash out and then a cash in.
Yeah, the transaction happens when one or other of the parties come back online, and
Exactly, when it becomes a cash out or a cash in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Julie.
Okay, any other questions? Right, let me move on in that case and start talking about message routing. So let me start from a simple question. How do we connect schemes together? Our answer is via a proxy. Used to be called a cross-network provider, but I kind of prefer, for reasons that I hope will become clear, to call it a proxy. It's a specialized implementation of an adapter. An adapter is a standard pattern that has two interfaces. In most adapters, the interfaces are different and the adapter converts content between them. In our implementation, the interfaces can be the same, and we don't require that they should be the same, but they can be the same. This is kind of important for non-repudiation reasons. But anyway, moving along. So both sides of the adapter in this example will speak, for instance, the IIPS extension of ISO 20022, a standard way of communicating with a scheme. But each side speaks that to a different scheme. And the proxy essentially acts as a concentrator. So in any given scheme, the switch can talk to the proxy without needing to know how to route that message to any of the DFSPs in the other schemes on the other side of the proxy. So when a switch caches the sort of information that I was talking about before, so for instance, where the switch in scheme A says, oh, okay, I know that if I want to send a message to DFSP2, I should send it via proxy A. That is true regardless of how many and how complicated the routes inter-scheme are between Scheme A and DFSP2. All it needs to know is which proxy to talk to. Sorry, is someone asking something?
Okay. How are you?
Sorry, could whoever's talking
It's
mute,
Manzi.
please? Manzi. Okay.
And he's just gone on mute. So carry on.
Okay. Real. So, given that there may be more than one proxy attached to a scheme, we need to be able to associate a DFSP ID with the proxy that represents it using the process that I've just described. So our requirement then is that a DFSP should be able to address a message, as it might be a post quotes message, to the intended recipient without needing to know if the recipient's in the same scheme as them or not. They should just send it. In this case, in the case that we talked about, if DFSP1 were to issue a post quotes message, it would just issue it to DFSP2 without needing to know where DFSP2 was. And the underlying architecture should manage routing the message via the proxies to the correct destination. Our proposal is that proxies should be registered in each scheme to which they are attached, and they should be registered as a particular kind of thing in the same way as foreign exchange providers and DFSPs that support PISP are registered as a particular kind of entity in a scheme. Now, this means that the switch needs to be able to obtain on demand a list of the proxies which are attached to it. And when any switch receives a message from a proxy, it stores the association between the DFSP who sent the message and the proxy who forwarded it. Now, if it needs to send a message to that DFSP, it needs to know, it knows which proxy to send the message to. And that will always be the same, no matter, as I say, how complicated the relationship is between the proxy and the eventual recipient of the message. That will, we think, provide a simple mechanism to manage routing between arbitrary numbers and complexities of schemes and DFSP. And it's based around a simple modular loop principle, which is you always find out where a DFSP is before you try to communicate with them. So there will be changes required to implement this at the switch, but that's, we think, is more or less all. I'll be talking in more detail about those at the DA session. Any questions on routing? I'll take that as a no.
Yep, doesn't appear so.
Okay. So I will now go on to the question of balancing obligations. So the requirement is, I think, that when a payment passes through a scheme, any scheme, the scheme needs to record its passage. There needs to be something in the logs that says this payment passed through this scheme, and particularly that it passed between these proxies, because it's true even if none of the eventual parties to a payment are direct members of that scheme. You remember in the example we just looked at, the regional scheme doesn't have any parties which are directly associated with the payment. I'm going to leave aside questions of currency conversion for the moment. So even if none of the eventual parties are direct members of that scheme, we need to be able to ensure that we can always trace the complete path of a payment through the system. That is to say, we must be able to say where, through which proxies a payment passed, and how it got from where it started to where it finished. And the balances between all the position accounts in any scheme must always net to zero. Debits and credit must balance, which means every credit in a scheme must be balanced by a corresponding debit. So what we think we will need to do is to attach position and settlement ledgers to attach to each proxy in both the modular loop schemes to which the proxy belongs. Now, you will recall that when we were, well, maybe you won't recall, but I will tell you anyway. When we first started thinking about cross-network providers, we imagined them as being financial participants in the schemes, in both of the schemes to which they belonged, i.e. Entities which had a real account holding presence in those schemes. What we're trying to do here is to say you can split those two things from each other. It's possible that schemes or other entities may set up accounts which are used to hold settled funds on behalf of a particular scheme which is represented by a proxy. And the proxy itself doesn't need to be an entity which does that, because it can be the scheme to which it belongs which manages that process. That's essentially the topology that we've been talking to CBC about. And then we can say, well, for a given modular loop scheme, the title of the account is something like funds which are due to or from the DFSPs which are represented by this proxy. Those are the obligations. And for any given transfer through a proxy, a debit in one of the schemes it's attached to will be exactly matched by a credit in the other scheme it's attached to. So again, the other difference between the way in which we're thinking about DFSPs, about cross-network providers and proxies now, is that we had previously assumed that cross-network providers would also be doing currency conversion. As you know, we have changed that assumption. We've now split off the function of currency conversion and the provision of currency conversion services to FXPs, and there is no longer any requirement for an FXP to be in the same place as a proxy. So we're not expecting currency conversion to happen in the gap between schemes. We're expecting it to happen in one scheme or another, which doesn't, as you've seen from the example, doesn't have to be the same scheme as either of the parties to the payment. So, for instance, in a payment of 100 Kenyan shillings from DFSP A to DFSP B, DFSP A sends its request to Scheme 1, Scheme 2 sends it to DFSP B, and they are connected via a proxy. And we will see that in Scheme 1, DFSP A is debited 100 Rand. Haha, I should have said Kenyan shillings, shouldn't I? My mistake.
I was wondering.
The proxy, okay, just see if you're paying attention. The proxy gets a credit of 100 Rand, or possibly Kenyan shillings. And on the other side, the proxy gets a debit of 100 Rand and DFSPB gets a credit of 100 Rand. So as we see there, proxy A always gets a balance between debits and credits. Each credit is balanced by a debit and vice versa. Sorry, each credit in one scheme is balanced by a debit in the other scheme and vice versa. So that is how we envisage that the obligations will be tracked in the schemes, even if the scheme doesn't have any of the direct parties to the payment attached to it. Any questions on that?
I'm not
Okay.
getting any questions. No.
Well, terrific. So I want to look now at managing timeouts. This is an important thing. We time transfers out because we don't want poor people's funds to be unreachable for long periods in transactions that may not complete. So when a debtor DFSP requests the execution of a payment, it says when the transfer should time out. And our principles about timeout management are there should always be a single source of truth for timeout management. In a modular loop world, that's the switch. No participant should time a transfer out unilaterally. So a DFSP, even if it thinks the transfer is timed out, should not time out a transfer without getting permission to do so. When a participant asks after the status of a transfer, then the transfer status may be pending, and pending means not yet finalized. And we say that a participant must wait until they can obtain a finalized state before timing a transfer out. So the question is, how do we replicate these principles in an ecosystem where a transfer may be passing through multiple switches? Because I want to go back to our first principle, we need a single source of truth. Our principle then is a simple one. It basically says a switch should only enforce a timeout if it's the switch to which the creditor DFSP is directly attached. So requests for information about a transfer, as I've just described, which sending DFSPs and perhaps other parties as well may send saying what's happened to this transfer, they will be addressed to the creditor party in any case, so they should always be forwarded to that switch. Now we have a single.
Michael, before you go on, Julie's raised
Yeah.
a question in the chat, which I
Okay.
think we should be addressing.
Marvelous.
see
Sorry,
Yes.
that was related to the previous slide. I didn't want to interrupt your
Yeah.
flow. So
I
you
had a
can
few
carry
questions
on,
about the
Michael.
previous slide as well, so
All right,
please
I'll
go
go back.
back to that.
I'll go back to the previous slide.
Julie, please
Not this
go.
one. This one.
So even the one before, right? It was my comments are related to the accounting
Okay.
entry. I didn't want to interrupt your flow, but we can catch
Not
up
at
on
all.
this later.
Yep.
So I think for me, like, two things is one, I think at some point we will need to discuss the unhappy scenario when you can create for some reason one pair of accounting entry, but not the other. And also, like, usually what you expect is a reconciliation mechanism to make sure that effectively, like, you do have mirroring of each accounting entry, right?
Mhm. So how would that work? I mean, so one of the things, so one of the things I want to say, and I will again defer to those who know more about modular loop than I do. One of the things I want to say is that generally speaking, we've said that we don't like reconciliation. It's because it's expensive. We want to give people sound reasons for trusting what's in our system. And the idea of this arrangement is that you can always say, I know what happened in my system, even if I don't know what eventually happened somewhere else. My view, I think, is that schemes will only connect with each other if regulators and the operators of those schemes want to do so and think it's a good idea. As part of that, they will put in place mechanisms that ensure that the internal operators of the member schemes can trust the information that they've got. And obviously, one of the things which I will come around to saying later on is that we will provide a way for participants to find out the full progress of a transfer to which they are a party, i.e. everywhere it went in terms of movement through switches, which proxies handled it, what happened to it on the way, all of that kind of stuff. Does that sort of answer your questions?
It does. And to be fair, like, I think no one likes reconciliation, right? And everybody wants to move away from this. But the reality is somehow this is a journey. And I think the trust you're mentioning, it takes time to build.
Yep. Let's hope so. Okay, Paul, you had some questions.
No, I think those have been addressed in that discussion. So thank you.
Well, always a pleasure. Okay, so I'm going to go on. Okay, so any questions on timeouts? A fascinating question on which I have to say we've spent a great deal of time and heated discussion, but not necessarily of great interest to everybody. Any questions? Okay. Let me then move on to the question of liquidity cover. Now, as you know, liquidity cover assures the creditor DFSP that it's safe to disburse its funds to the beneficiary immediately because the debtor DFSP funds have been reserved by the switch against known good funds. A requirement for a proxy, I think, is that it should be backed by good funds administered by the schemes that it belongs to and available, at least in principle, to both schemes. They may be held in a single account or in different accounts. But holding them in a single account is not a credit risk, I think, since by definition, as we've just seen, a credit in one scheme is mirrored by a debit in another scheme and vice versa. So the good funds that are required by a proxy are actually working capital. We need them because we want, I think, to allow schemes to settle independently of each other. And if schemes settle independently of each other, there's a possibility, for instance, that as a consequence of scheme A having settled, but the regional scheme not yet having settled, there may be funds which the proxy, in effect, which are owed from the regional scheme to scheme A and which have to be disbursed to the creditor parties in scheme A, and the working capital is used to support that. Now, the question then is, what if the DFSP's good funds are known to some other scheme? So I think that actually this slide, I've kind of just said what this slide is. So in this case, a proxy represents the net of all the transactions, and the good funds account represents the net of all transactions. And it's possible that we might say, again, looking at the relation of trust that we just talked about, the creditor DFSP can rely on the liquidity check carried out by its scheme against its local proxy to warrant that sufficient funds are available to reimburse it for the payment it is executed. And that means essentially that the proxy needs to have settled funds which can be checked and warranted by the switch to which the creditor party belongs. An alternative plan, if schemes trust each other, then we might say that liquidity cover only needs to be held once by the debtor DFSP. And therefore the rule for the switch is only perform the liquidity check if the debtor DFSP is part of your scheme. Now, a proxy's good funds still need to be sufficient to settle in either scheme. There will never be a problem if both schemes, or when both schemes settle. And we might say in that case that position accounts for the intermediate proxies are allowed to exceed settled funds because of the relationship of trust that exists between the schemes, not between the DFSPs. Any questions on that side of things?
No.
Sorry,
no
Michael,
questions there,
I
Casey?
don't understand.
Sorry, Julie, go ahead.
I don't understand the last point. Do you mean that on the intermediate proxy you can get overdraft facility?
Yes.
Okay.
Or it might be a line of credit or something like that. That is exactly what I mean. So at the moment, we require settled funds to be available, and if a transfer, let's say, if a proxy doesn't have sufficient settled funds to meet those obligations, then the transfer is rejected by the switch. If it is the case that this is a network of schemes that trust each other, then the appearance of a payment execution request from a proxy is taken by the switch to mean that the liquidity check has happened somewhere in the system, and the funds will eventually be made available to the creditor party through the process of settlement, though those may be multiple settlements which occur at different times. In that case, it doesn't say, in that case, the creditor to the DFSP needs to wait for its funds, but it does say, I understand that the proxy is able to provide those funds on demand if required, without needing to settle them in advance. And therefore, I will allow the payment without doing a liquidity cover check. Now, I'm not saying that schemes should work like that. I'm just saying that if they do work like that, Moduloop, I think, should be able to support them.
Because there is no significant risk as a result.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Makes sense. And just like one thing as well, like apologies. When you say like liquidity cover, I'm guessing that you're only talking about cash as liquidity cover, right?
No, I mean, we explicitly say it should be any form of collateral that can be recognised by the scheme. So, for instance, if someone deposits, bearer bonds or a letter of credit, as long as those can be verified by the scheme, then they can count as well as cash actually held in accounts.
Okay, so it's HQLA.
Yes.
I call okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, someone else was about to say something.
Yeah, that was me. There is an inherent assumption there, and we used to live in a day where we thought that banks going bankrupt was impossible. There is a liquidity risk of some sort if you have any form of credit. So if it's running on a credit, then we should be flagging that there is a low risk, one hopes, but not an unlikely one, that there is a risk of funds not being fulfilled should there be a collapse of a bank.
That is true for commercial banks, but not, I think, for central banks. And I would imagine that in most cases where the second plan were to be adopted, it would be in cases where it is the central banks that are holding the accounts rather than the commercial banks.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's but the assumption there is that if a commercial bank fails to pay its liability to the central bank, depending on how the central bank apportions any reserves it's got within its systems, that accounting procedure might take precedence over this agreement, is where I'm saying, even with the central bank, because if it's a fund, so let's take it's coming from Zambia, a commercial bank owes the central bank to pay through to the proxy. That commercial bank in Zambia is no longer liquid, therefore it can't settle its side of the debt, therefore the central bank can't, etc., etc., etc.
Well, one thing that I would say is that in a situation like that, the commercial bank should definitely have lodged good funds with the central bank in order for the central bank to, or in order for the national switch to process the payment in the first place. All of this is dependent on a liquidity check happening somewhere at the debtor DFSP, or sorry, in relation to the debtor DFSP, in the scheme that the debtor DFSP belongs to. Now, it is possible that a badly arranged IIPS scheme might wind up in a situation where, for instance, funds can be withdrawn from a settled funds account without the permission of the scheme, and therefore what seemed to be a sufficient balance at the time the transfer was made turns out not to be a sufficient balance at the time settlement was made. But that is a problem of the organisation of the IIPS scheme and not a problem of the scheme itself. At least that's what I think. I also want to say that it is not our intention to advise people to choose one of these schemes, one of these arrangements or another. All we want to do is to say, these are the facilities that we intend to provide so that you can use them in this way if you want to.
I agreed. This is not, it's just that if someone they need to work through the liquidity and make sure that they are actually safe, not assume.
No, absolutely. And I'm sure that being central banks, they will be all over that like a rash.
They probably are a little bit more now that they've seen banks go under and runs on banks again.
Okay, any other questions?
I think I'm more concerned about central bank collapse than commercial bank collapse. I think that has repercussions well beyond anything within our scope.
I think it does, yes. It's least of our problems, it might be.
Yes.
Okay.
Can I just add something like regarding this as well? Like I think about what you said with like, you know, the withdrawal of the scheme, like potentially like you can implement some check in the scheme as well, right? Introducing different balance and then checking checking the balance that take into account the future liquidity settle that you would get before doing a new withdrawal, and also implementing some limit so that limit and timing so that you know like you can leave a certain amount of funds at all the time during all the time in the scheme, so that there is not like a full withdrawal.
Absolutely. And that, I mean, the problem is, I think, that requires a measure of control over the accounts, which means that the accounts must be particular kinds of account. I mean, there must be an account which can be controlled, as you say, eventually by the scheme, so that the scheme is able to say, you can't take this amount out because you already have obligations. Yeah. Okay, I'm conscious of time. Sorry.
Yeah.
Another question.
I'm conscious of the time. We are coming up to the end, but Michael, please carry on. I think this is too important to be cut short.
Well, I'm almost there.
Yeah.
The only other thing I have to talk about is reporting. I don't have anything very interesting to say about reporting, except that any participant should be able to see the full history of any transfer they were directly involved in. For FXPs, this should mean the currency conversion only. Any scheme should be able to see the full history of any transfer that passed through their scheme. And every scheme and every participant will see the same message, since at least in principle, we don't want to do content conversion. So it should be the case that the ISO 20022 message that started out from the originating institution was passed unmodified through all of the intermediate institutions, and it should be possible for them to confirm both at the time and subsequently that those messages really are the same as each other.
Assuming that intermediate schemes are using a messaging format that supports all of the content in the originating message.
It's different from that, I think. It means that it assumes that they are all supporting the same content. Now, if content conversion needs to be carried out, then obviously the non-repudiation chain is broken as a consequence.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Okay, carry on.
Okay, so the other thing is linked schemes will need somewhere to have a merged reporting database with proper segmentation to allow administrators to see only the parts they should have access to. I'm going to say role-based access control because it sounds like I know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
And that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Can I just say, before I briefly take any questions, that if anybody does have questions and wants to discuss any of this, then by all means contact me. We should have a Slack channel. If not, I'll set one up. But the more people ask questions, make comments, criticize, the better the solution we are eventually going to wind up with.
Okay. Michael, before we move on, if you create that Slack channel, can you share it on the Product Council channel, please, so that people know where to look?
Yeah, I will do.
And separately, can you share this deck with me, and I'll put it on the repo?
No, it's a secret.
Okay. So, questions, anyone?
Yes, I have one. So, Michael, on reporting, like, do you include things like what are the transactions in transit, and also like balance check?
Sorry?
On reporting, do you include functionality like balance check, and also like or at least understanding your list of obligation at a given time?
I would say the balance check is logged, but is not currently one of the things that we store in a reporting database. We should, is the answer. But I think this is an area where where Mojaloop needs to be doing some more work in the future to provide enhanced reporting facilities, which will easily include, as you say, things like when the balance check was performed, what were the balances that were checked against each other. So that is definitely something that people will want to be able to check. Okay.
Yeah, you made the statement earlier on regarding it being an IIPS.
Yep.
ISO 20022. How many of those exist in the current deployments that you're aware of?
I will answer that question in relation to the world, and the answer is none.
Okay, so what is the plan for countries where there are, what is the process for traditional ISO 222 as an interim? Is that we have to design as we go, or?
No, the plan at the moment is that we, as well, I hope you know, Mojaloop is working with ISO 20022 to enhance the specification to provide the functionalities that we need. We expect, and we have agreed with the ISO 20022 organization, that we will act as if our proposals have been accepted, and we will propose an enhanced ISO 20022, which is workable in the Mojaloop context, as the message format, or the API format, I should say, for the COMESA system. Obviously, ISO 20022 is very interested in this because they don't have too many examples of regional interpayment systems with currency conversion in emerging and developing economies. So that's what the plan is.
Okay, so that requires an upgrade of all the switches in country to a standard.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Is my answer. But yes, pardon me, if they want to manage non-repudiation signatures, and if their switching country currently supports non-repudiation signatures, then yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing. And as I say, get in touch with me. I will put together a Slack channel. I will share this presentation with Paul. In fact, I'll drop it on the Product Council channel, which is probably the easiest thing.
Yeah. Sure.
And as I say, there is on the Design Authority Slack channel a link to a doodle poll for a meeting to talk about the technical aspects of this. At the moment, it looks as if that's going to be next Monday morning UTC. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. And thanks, everyone. I'll be publishing the recording of this on the Product Council channel as well. So thank you, everyone, and see you again soon.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Bye.
Michael.
Thank you.